Officially, good afternoon. Happy Thursday, right? Thursday, first full day of the BDC Annual Conference 2022. Nice to see people in 3D and not be looking at you like a Brady Bunch screen. So welcome. And before we get started officially, I want to have Len Valentino, our CEO, come up. Len has been with NHF now for a couple years, but this is his first in-person CCSC meeting, and so he has a few words to share.
You're supposed to clap after I make the comments, if you like them. So thank you, Colette, and thank you all for being here. Colette's kind of correct. So this is my first CCSC as NHF's president and CEO, but I was part of CCSC in the beginning, actually before NHF took over CCSC. So this has been a really important program for me as a physician, as an HTC director, and this continues to be a real priority for the National Hemophilia Foundation as representing the community. The goal that I have is obviously about access to care. And access to care is the key component. You can have all the innovation in the world, the best research and innovation, but if people don't have access to that innovation, it means nothing. So the CCSC is really one of the key drivers around access to care. And one of the other components that I want to emphasize is if you think about what the name CCSC represents, there's sustainability in there, and that's sustainability of the care model, sustainability of the treatment centers that can provide care for individuals with hereditary blood disorders. So CCSC is a really important component for NHF, and it's a priority for us moving forward. We're really grateful for Colette's leadership in this area. She's been not just a leader for NHF, but on the national stage as well. And we're really grateful for Colette's leadership in this area, and she continues to work tirelessly. So we're appreciative. So she's the one who deserves the round of applause, not me. So thank you, and enjoy the rest of the conference, and hopefully we'll all get a chance to engage during the next couple of days. Thanks for being here.
So can you guys hear? Okay, that's better. It was hard to hear. So I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Ed Pizzala to get us started. And I know people continue to be walking in the room. There's a couple issues. One, you can't find the room because 351 goes one way, but it doesn't really actually get here. So I'm glad you guys made it, and we'll have people coming through, but we'll keep the program going. Dr. Pizzala.
Thank you, Lynn. Thank you, Colette, and thanks to all of you for joining us this afternoon. I'm Dr. Ed Pizzala. I'm CEO of Enlightenment BioConsult, LLC, and I'd like to welcome you to today's program. We're pleased to be able to provide you with, we hope will be an informative and meaningful session entitled CCSC Presents, Managing Costs and Clinical Outcomes While Preparing for a Rapidly Changing Therapeutic Landscape. And as a reminder, this program does have credit for HTC providers. CCSC is jointly provided by NHF Impact Education LLC and is supported by charitable donations from founding and supporting sponsor Takeda and additional support from Bayer AG Pharmaceuticals, BioMarin, CSL Behring, Genentech Inc., Hemophilia Alliance, Novo Nordisk Inc., Sanofi Genzyme, and Spark Therapeutics. There will be time for questions and answers at the end of the session, and if you're attending online, please use the chat feature at any time to submit your comments and questions. It works. Today I'm joined by a multidisciplinary group of experts representing various important stakeholders in improving access to care for bleeding disorders community. Representing the HTC perspective is Becky Burns, Chief Operating Officer and Chief Financial Officer, Bleeding and Clotting Disorders Institute. Mark Redding, MD, Professor of Medicine and Director of the Center for Bleeding and Clotting Disorders, University of Minnesota Medical Center. And representing the payer plan sponsor perspective, myself and Jeff Dunn, PharmD, MBA, and who is Chief Clinical Officer, Cooperative Benefits Group, and representing the employer purchaser's perspective is Sal Morena, Senior Vice President, Pharmacy Practice Lead, Hospitals and Health Systems, Alliant Employer Benefits, and representing patient advocacy, Colette Koulianos, MBA, Vice President of Payer Relations, National Hemophilia Foundation. So I'd like to take just a few moments to talk a bit about CCSC, which was formed in 2014 by a prominent group of HTC directors, clinicians, and administrators, along with payer and managed care, medical, and pharmacy directors. And the goal is to augment the sustainability of HTCs by improving the communication between payers, purchasers, and providers, broadening access to extensive hemophilia-related outcomes data, disseminating rigorous standards of care, quality, and cost management, improving the recognition of HTC data and value, and obtaining advanced analytics on a rare, high-cost disease, and gain insight and actionable best practices amongst the group. We also have the VBCDC, a unique opportunity connecting payers with patient advocacy organizations. The Value-Based Chronic Disease Collaborative was launched in 2020 to connect healthcare payers and purchasers with patient advocacy groups to improve access and quality of care. It aims at tailoring strategies most appropriate to the characteristics of the unique patient populations represented by those advocacy organizations. And from 2020 to 2022, 5 virtual VBCDC meetings have connected dozens of patient advocacy organization stakeholders with payer stakeholders. The next meeting is October 21st. I've introduced you to the various stakeholders on the panel. Before we get started, let's review their perspectives regarding specialty medications. Specialty medications represent novel and effective opportunities for treatment of chronic conditions. The costs associated with specialty medications are one of the most rapidly increasing costs in healthcare expenditures. High deductible health plans and other approaches to cost shifting have helped to control employer spend. Copay accumulators and maximizers and alternative funding models represent other means by which employers seek to manage that drug spend. Benefits designs have traditionally been one size fits all, which is an approach that may not work for all patients, for all types of patient groups. Especially medications can change the course of chronic disease. It can change patients' lives. The employer use of high deductible health plans has created some cost barriers to care, and these barriers limit use of specialty medications, especially by low-wage workers. Third-party assistance programs, copay support, free medications provide meaningful value. There's less abandonment of the prescriptions, greater adherence, longer persistence, and measurable clinical impact. The consequences of high patient cost share is increased non-adherence and sometimes even discontinuation of therapies, which may lead to the progression of disease or other problems. Financial toxicity, the emotional and psychological distress in patients because of the added expense of their medications, and patient concerns regarding the accumulators and other programs. Many patients are not given notice that copay accumulators are going into effect until the pharmacist points it out, and they may have many, many questions about these programs. As you can see in the chart, the abandonment rate for branded medications varies considerably from deductible to higher deductible. I would now like to invite to the podium Colette Koulianos to provide an update on the current payer environment.
Thank you, Ed. Colette Koulianos, also known as Colette Koulianos, but thank you. I can't, I'd be remiss if I didn't start this by saying that, you know, CCSC, Len's right, that CCSC as it is today actually existed before it was known as CCSC. It actually, pharmaceutical company was doing payer roundtables, and during one of those meetings, one of the payers said, you know, this would come off a lot better if it was actually run by an advocacy organization as opposed to pharma. And Michelle Rice, who's in the room, Michelle, thank you. She brought this idea back to NHF, and she actually took the lead on this and brought me into it at the very first meeting that NHF held, and I've been part of it ever since. I took over running CCSC a couple years in when I left the HTC, where I was the executive director, and came here. So first, thank you, Michelle, for your work in this area. And then real quick, VBCDC, you heard Dr. Pizzala mention the Value-Based Chronic Disease Collaborative. We were getting calls from pharmaceutical companies outside of hemophilia saying, we wish you would train other advocacy groups to do what you're doing, because more advocacy groups need to be pulling a seat up at the table and speak on behalf of their patients, because patients don't always have that seat, right? And then we had payers saying, I wish other advocacy groups did this, because all they ever want, give me, give me, give me. They don't want to, they don't want to concede or realize that this is a high cost and that we have a job to do as well. And that's what NHF does so well here. And so we said, why not run it, bring in other disease groups? It's not really watering down what we do. It's giving us opportunity to reach a lot more payers that we weren't reaching just through CCSC, because other payers who wouldn't get involved because it was just one disease state now are. So we've actually expanded our reach, and that's been good for us and other groups. And when we run into all these access schemes, it can't be just hemophilia that has an issue that tries to stop it through legislation. Legislators won't do anything if it's one disease group, but when more are impacted, then they're more likely to respond. And so we use that opportunity to get those other disease groups up to speed so that they can also advocate on behalf of the community, their communities. So we know copay accumulators have been a conversation since the beginning of 2017, and they have proliferated. 83% of plans, commercial plans today, have a copay accumulator on them. They can be on any plan, any commercial plan, whether they're a marketplace plan, small group plan, large plan, ERISA plan, because they're ACA compliant. It's simply a change in the rules. It says, we used to let you use assistance and let it count to your out-of-pocket or your deductible, and you can still use it, but it no longer counts. That's basically what it is. All right. Then we started to see, when we saw 14 states plus Puerto Rico and 2 others pending with anti-accumulator legislation, the introduction of HR 5801, all of which NHF has spearheaded. Then they started to move towards copay maximizers. But the rationale of all these programs, end of the day, high cost continues to keep payers up at night, and costs continue to go up and skyrocket, and they're saying we have to do something. And so in 2016, they were actually enlightened, if you will, Enlightened BioConsult, maybe that's why you named your company, but they were enlightened to the fact that, do you know that the 1.2% of people in your plan that cost you 40 or more % of your spend, so the very small group of people you're really trying to hone in on, they actually are getting assistance from manufacturers to help them with their out-of-pocket. So they have no skin in the game. The people you're trying to control actually are circumventing the whole game. And they were like, they are. And so that's when the whole accumulator movement started, thanks to PBM friends who admit, Express Scripts and CVS like to say they're the ones who brought this to the attention. But so these games, the games begin. But the games began in 2017. We had the accumulators. Patients had no skin in the game. So now we're going to force you to have skin in the game. Copay assistance, they believed, incentivized patients to choose a high-cost drug instead of a generic. Well, 99.4%, I believe, IQVIA's data says, of assistance that's used is on drugs that don't have a generic or biosimilar equivalent. So, and that's the case in our room. Copay assistance helps patients circumvent the plan design. Not true. Patients don't use copay assistance until they've gone through the whole process. Once they get approved for the drug and they're ready to actually get their going, that's when they use the assistance. So that's another myth fact deal. Allowing copay assistance drives plan costs, and it drives premium costs, and it drives drug costs. That's their mentality. And they say it violates IRS HSA guidance. Well, we have clearly, none of those are true. We have myth fact sheets we've been developing. We started, NHF led the charge to start the All Copays Count Coalition, which is a nationally recognized coalition that are of advocacy organizations and provider groups that are saying enough's enough with this stuff. You can't keep pushing the cost on the patients. So we have well over 100 members in the All Copays Count Coalition. 80 some are national organizations. And then there's some regional and state-based advocacy groups that are also involved. But we've developed fact sheets. We've come up with a new website that's getting ready to launch, I think the 12th of September, don't quote me, and it's brilliant, if I must say so myself. We worked on that website. We're the one bringing it out, but we're launching it under the All Copays Count umbrella. So I told you then the next thing they moved to is maximizer programs. And so we've seen an uptake in these. In fact, 73% of commercial plans have copay maximizer embedded in the plan. What's the difference? Copay accumulator, I told you, can be on any plan because it's ACA compliant. It's just to change the rules. You have to pay your own out of pocket. But a copay maximizer says that the drug is a specialty drug, and therefore, as a specialty drug, it's a non-essential health benefit. Like, if you know the 10 essential health benefits, one's what? Prescription drugs, specialty drugs, or prescription drug. So who decided they're not an essential health benefit? Well, they did. And that's the loophole they're using. So they say that we're going to cover the drug, but as a non-essential health benefit. And by doing so, they can remove that drug out of the plan design, put it over here into a different formulary list, and then they don't have any limit on out-of-pocket costs on those. So if the patient has a drug that's in that formulary, then they can get the drug so long as they use the manufacturer assistance, and it's at no cost to them. Do you see the irony here? And guess what? It's the same two companies that started copay accumulators that run those maximizer companies called Save on SP and Prudent RX. Yes, a different name so that they can confuse the masses. But they're actually forcing patients in that scenario to use the manufacturer assistance. If they say, I don't want to use it, they have to pay the entire amount that the manufacturer would have paid. So if it's a $15,000 assistance amount, they have to pay it out of their own pocket, and that does not count to their deductible or out of pocket. And so, and the way they're doing it is they say it's a covered non-essential health benefit. That's the problem. All right, so those are, if you want to say version 1.0, the copay accumulator adjustment programs and the copay maximizer programs. Version 2.0, if you will, of these schemes is the PAP program. Now let's go after the free drug, all right? And so that's the newest, latest. You've heard me talk about, some of you, alternative funding solutions. There's over 20 companies doing this already. They just started. We saw the first one in 2020. But what they essentially do is they target only ERISA plans, so self-funded health plans, attempting to reduce their specialty drug spend and catastrophic claims exposure by removing the drugs that are non-essential, the specialty drugs, out of their design and saying, we're not covering them. And then they have this company, the solution, alternative funding solution vendor, do a white glove concierge service with the patient and help them walk through the patient assistance free program. And that way the payer, the self-funded company, which by the way, I didn't say this, 64% of all commercially insured are on a self-funded plan, okay? 64% are on an ERISA plan. So that means that these companies are being targeted with this, and they're saying to these companies, you could save, they're saying things like you can save up to 100%. They're saying things like you can save up to 60% now, because they're really taking the remainder of it as their cost avoidance fee. So these companies, what do they get out of it? We walk the patient through to get free drug, and oh shucks, by doing it, we'll take 30% of AWP, which ain't what nobody paid. And so guess what? If you truly did carve out the drug, the patient could walk through that process themselves and you would pay nothing. But that's the game, okay? But today they're not carving it out like they did at the first ones in 2020. They're just denying at the point of authorization. The biggest company doing this now is Magellan. They started it, and they're doing it to preserve stop-loss coverage and to keep the plan ACA compliant. So, I mean, we're going to get into in our panel discussion, but Sal and Becky can talk about some of the experiences recently and where Sal's seeing this pop up and the amount of people who are clamoring to have this, to roll this out. So this is how it works. Medications requested. So let's say they had to call Magellan. We have a patient who needs whatever, XYZ factor. They reject automatically. Then it goes to the alternative funding provider, who reaches out with a white glove hand and says, I'm going to help you. I need you to sign a power of attorney and give me your financial background data, your tax returns, and then they apply on behalf of the member to the manufacturer-free program, something the patient could do themselves and save the company all that money. But while they're waiting for approval on the manufacturer-free program, they actually, the nice guys they are, they use the manufacturer copay assistance to help the patient with any out-of-pocket costs during that time, essentially screwing the pharmaceutical companies you know, in the front and back. And I'm literally, I don't pimp for pharma. I don't, that's not my job, but that really sucks. Like, and they're very vocal about this. So now if the patient gets approved, member's eligible, then they start getting the drug from the pharmaceutical company. One big missing problem here is it's not in the same timely fashion that the patient is used to getting, but Magellan says it's the same experience that members always received. They don't get the ancillary infusion supplies. If the kid has a port, they don't get the port kits. There's all kinds of problems with this scenario. Then the member gets the medication for the period of approved time, and then this white glove company will track when it's due, and the white glove company will reapply on the member's behalf. If the member's not eligible, there's a couple other schemes they try now. That's why they call it alternative funding solutions. It's not one solution. So first we're going to go for the PAP, the free program. If we're not successful, we'll try drug importation. By raise a hand, how many are hearing about drug importation? Yeah, okay. I'm not seeing many hands up, but I'm telling you it's happening big time. And guess what? Medical tourism. We'll fly you and your family. One of our blood disorder families was offered a trip for 10 days, all expenses paid to the Netherlands, and first class. And when you, and the gig is when you're there, we'll set you up with a doctor appointment. You'll go, they'll write you a year's prescription. Your company will pay it. You'll bring your product back. So you're importing your own drug. It's not the same thing as drug importation. You're bringing it back as a tourist, if you will. So if none of those gigs work, then they have two choices, and they either run it back through and process it as a pharmacy claim, which is what Magellan actually puts in writing, or in some cases the employer says, oh, well, it doesn't work, then we're not going to do anything. So then the member's stuck without their meds. This is tragic. There's so many issues that are these raised. The uptake is significant. We just saw the first ones in 2020, and Gallagher, which is a big benefits broker consultant, is saying 40% of plans are actually, Adam Fine had posted something. So Gallagher did a survey of their large employer group, and they said up to 40% of the plans have either 10% have implemented already. So think about that. 64% of all commercially insured are on an ERISA plan. 10% of those ERISA plans have already implemented this, and another 30% are either in process or looking into it. We all better be afraid of this scenario. There's risk to the HTC, threat to the patient, because optimal outcomes would not be achieved when there's delays or can't get their medications. Level of care greatly diminished. There's a threat to the whole overall healthcare system. They say there's like $500 billion in wasted spending because people aren't adherent to their treatment. And then it goes on to progress. You know, if we were to have the HCCs go away because of this, because if you can't serve your patients, you're already running the risk. Every HTC that's in the room knows you keep getting cut out of the exclusive specialty pharmacy networks. And now these are taking other patients away, but yet you still have to provide all the same level of care and service you always did, but with less and less patients in which to serve. If they were to go away, manufacturers would not have a finite number of centers in which to run their clinical trials through, which is what's brought all this treatment and therapy that we enjoy today to market. So a bad situation. These are the providers that exist today. This list is not all inclusive, folks. This is scary, but in 2 years, that's how many companies decided that this is a gig they want to get into. And then here's cold hard facts. Here's the impact. 340B drug pricing program. Adam Fine posted this. Becky shared this chart with me. But look at line, whoop, my yellow highlighter moved when I transferred this over. It's supposed to not be under sexually transmitted. I'm joking. It's supposed to be under the Hemophilia Treatment Center, which is the fourth down in the bottom section. We're the only group that's had a net negative 10.1% change in purchases of 340B in the last year is under the Hemophilia Treatment Center. So we know it's impacting our programs and our centers. And so that's why it's an important issue for all of us at NHF. So I'm going to hand this over now to Dr. Redding. Thank you. And I'll answer questions at the end if you guys have any.
Thanks, Colette. So my task is to just give you a brief update on emerging therapies. This is tough to do in a couple of minutes, but I'll do my best. There's a lot going on in our space, as I'm sure you guys are all aware. This is a high-level summary slide. The point is there's a lot of stuff happening with new drug development that has the potential to not only radically change the way we treat our patients, but also have an impact on the kind of things we're talking about here today in terms of how we're going to pay for all this. So starting from the top right-hand side of the slide there are some really interesting novel oral therapies. They're a long ways off, but they're working on that. On the intravenous side, there are some things that are going to be here in the very near future. And I think you might even argue that some of these things are imminently going to arrive when it comes to gene therapy. So there are some really big things about to happen. On the other side of the slide there, under the subcutaneous category, that's where we see some of the really exciting new therapies, the rebalancing therapies, the TFPI inhibitors, the antithrombin knockdown drug, the fitusiran. There's a second generation factor VIII mimetic. These are drugs that are in phase 3 clinical trials, some of which have already wrapped up, others of which are well underway. And so the point is that in the next 2-3 years, we are going to have several new therapeutic options in hemophilia. The implications of this are great. One of the implications I think is really important for us to think very carefully about and talk very openly about is that the decision-making about which drug for which patient is going to get even more complicated than it is today. And it's already really complicated. So some of these drugs will have indications beyond just a single diagnosis. The rebalancing therapies, the anti-TFPI drugs, the antithrombin knockdown drug, these will work for hemophilia A, for hemophilia B, with inhibitors, without inhibitors. They may even work outside of hemophilia and other bleeding disorders. So we're gonna move well past these are the list of drugs for hemophilia A, these are the list of drugs for hemophilia B, and we're gonna have drugs that can potentially work across diagnoses. And that's gonna be a new challenge for all of us. And so the point is, a lot of stuff is happening, a lot of stuff is coming. It's going to be much more complicated in terms of decision-making clinically for me, but for all of us in terms of decision-making about how we're going to make all this happen and make sure that these drugs are available to our patients. To touch on the point that Len made in his opening comments, I think it really behooves us to have these conversations. Gene therapy, I mean, it's really close, you guys. I can give you the 2-minute overview of this. If you want a 60-minute overview, come to the nursing session right after this, because we're going to spend an hour talking about where we are with gene therapy. The role it's going to play is a little bit hard to know. Obviously, from a therapeutic standpoint, it's really different. This slide shows you kind of a conceptual overview of the difference between standard half-life factor, extended half-life factor, non-factor therapy, and gene therapy. And if you look at what the graphic is trying to depict, on the bottom, it's factor levels going up and down. On the top, it's the degree to which we've corrected the bleeding tendency. And as you can see with factor, those two things follow each other, right? So you give it as a factor, the level goes up, you've corrected the hemostatic defect, et cetera. With non-factor therapy, we correct the hemostatic defect to a certain degree without increasing the factor levels. So those are those drugs with those novel mechanisms of action. But when it comes to gene therapy, it's really both. So we're replacing that which was missing, but it's not a up and down, peak and trough kind of thing. This is ideally a long-term sustained correction of that factor deficiency, providing ongoing hemostasis in the normal range, ideally. We're not quite there yet, but that's the goal. And so just looking at this graphic and seeing how different that gene therapy box looks compared to the others, I mean, just from a visual perspective, you can think about how different this is going to be. So where are we with gene therapy? And again, this is the 2-minute version. The 60-minute version is going to be next door right after this. But as I'm sure you're all very well aware, 2 years ago, August of 2020, the FDA declined approval of the potentially first factor VIII gene therapy drug from BioMarin. The submission was based on data from the phase 1/2 study and interim analysis of a small subset of patients from the phase 3 study. And the bottom line is the FDA just didn't feel like they had the right amount of the type of data they wanted to say yes. Their recommendation was to complete the phase 3 study, which had 134 subjects in 2-year follow-up. That happened a year ago almost. So we are there. Those data are out, and so we expect very soon another submission and decision probably in the next several months. So this is happening. In Europe, a very similar pattern, although they're a little bit further ahead of us. In September of 2020, they also said no, wanted more data. They requested 1-year follow-up on the phase 3 study patients, and that's again already happened. And so we expect very soon a decision from the European regulatory agencies. And so this is moving along very quickly for hemophilia A. For hemophilia B, we're even further ahead now. So this drug is likely going to be decided upon very quickly. This is a CSL bearing, originally Unicure factor IX gene therapy drug. The phase 2 data were presented now 3 years ago, which seems like a long time ago. It was only 3 subjects, but very exciting. This drug was fast-tracked, and as you can see here, the phase 3 data have been very recently presented at the European Hemophilia meetings in February, and we expect a decision on this drug before the year is over. So it's coming, you guys. It's here. In terms of who's all eligible for gene therapy, this is a graphic that you've probably seen before. This has been shown in a variety of settings, and it's to give you a sense of the numbers of patients that are actually going to be receiving or eligible to receive gene therapy right out of the gate. And what the graphic represents here is if you take all the folks in the U.S. with hemophilia, now this just shows hemophilia A, so that's why the number is 18,000. If we include hemophilia B, it's more like 30,000. But if you look at the inclusion-exclusion criteria from the clinical trials, and if you assume that that's what the FDA-approved labels are going to say, then we're talking about a much smaller number of folks that are potentially eligible. Now, of course, we don't know what the FDA label is going to say. We don't know exactly what the payers are going to say. And we don't actually know what the perception in the patient community is going to be with regard to benefits and risks. Okay, so I think the points here are, number one, not all 30,000 hemophilia patients in the U.S. are going to get gene therapy in the first 6 months. But exactly how many and exactly how fast, I think, is really hard to know. And so I think it's really important for us to be mindful of that. Certainly, some of the other new therapies that we touched on that are coming down the pipeline may dampen enthusiasm for gene therapy for some of our patients and families. They may decide to wait until version 2. So it's going to affect our population for sure, but probably not in the large numbers that maybe we initially thought would be happening 4 or 5 years ago. So with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Ed, and again, we'll take questions during the panel discussion. And thank you for your attention.
Dr. Redding, thank you. Thank you so much for that overview. So at this point, we're going to start a discussion here. But I'd like to just point out sort of the positions of some of the stakeholders in the process here, of course. And importantly, the key stakeholder is not on here because everybody acknowledges that it's all about the patient. And it's about getting the drug to the patient, creating access in a system that is rather difficult to figure out and has a lot of ups and downs. But I think that we have to count on the fact that we're here to make sure that patients have access to the appropriate medications. So providers, are working through the HTCs for the most part and creating the Center of Excellence and Distribution model. Plan sponsors have innovative access programs for basically trying to fund gene therapies in some way and making sure that it's sustainable and that they can pay for it while they're paying for other things for other sorts of patients too. And purchasers are working with the plan sponsors to develop funding and coverage models for gene therapy and other innovative therapies. And so we should stay tuned. But since the hemophilia gene therapies are almost upon us, and they have, Colette tells me that the hemophilia A gene therapy has just been approved by the EMA for use in Europe. Of course, it will not be launched immediately because the individual countries have to decide the funding mechanisms and such things. But at this point, I think we can be pretty sure that gene therapy is going to be in the very near future. So at this point, what I'd like to do is ask our panel some questions here and start a discussion. And after this, then we'll carry on with a case presentation and discussion of that. So I'm going to start with Jeff and Sal and ask you to comment on what are the key concerns for purchasers of healthcare in terms of managing the specialty drug spend among current and emerging therapies for the management of bleeding disorders. So, Jeff?
You okay if I go first?
You go first.
So I'll tee this up because Sal is going to be much more sophisticated than the majority of employers I work with. So I wish we had an hour just to talk about these kind of issues. But I just want to frame my comments in that I've been in the payer space 21 years now. I've worked for 5 different organizations. I've co-founded 2 different PBMs that are truly transparent pass-through. So I have no problem talking about payers and why they do what they do. And I can see both sides of it. I can poke holes in it, but also kind of defend them. So I will say this, though. I think the problem is that we are siloed. And that needs to change or nothing will change. So from a employer perspective, when they, as Colette mentioned, when they continue to see double-digit drug prices each year, and that's actually slowed down. If you go back 5-6 years ago, we were seeing 40-50% year-over-year drug price increases, right? The drugs now are what, 25% of the total cost of care. So that's tripled in the last 3 or 4 years. So the problem with that is that all goes down to the employer. So when they see this, I've had employers come to me and say, literally say, this is my favorite. I had an employer come to me and say, I just want these 10 drugs taken off your formulary. I can't afford them anymore. And all they did was they took their 10 most expensive drugs and said, take them off. I can't do this anymore. So we had to explain to them why that doesn't make sense. But it's an affordability thing. So put your hat on from the perspective of an employer, right? When you see the increases, what can you do? There are literally 4 or 5 arrows in their quiver that they can do. It is coinsurance, deductibles, increasing premiums, exclusions, right? These all hurt the patient, but they do them because that's all they can do, because again, nobody else is kind of sharing the risk. And we're not talking about value-based pricing with pharmaceuticals and all the other stuff we should be talking about and the rest of the world talks about. So anyway, I'm rather for the sake of time, I'm going to stop. But, again, if you look at, and again, I'd love to talk about the maximizers and accumulators and why those are done. Again, 2% of the population is driving 50 to 60% of your costs. If you set up, if actuarially your benefit is set up for a deductible, and that deductible is now circumvented, again, this is 60% of your costs, right? That are being, the benefit is now blown out of the water. So again, I can talk to this from both perspectives. The other thing that I would just say is the other stakeholder, Ed mentioned the patient should be on there. The other one that should be, maybe we don't think about a lot, is the consultant / broker, right? So when I am trying to go out and talk to employers about why our model is better and why we should talk about value and cost effectiveness and not chasing rebates and not doing these kind of things, there's 2 things that I get asked about that come down to whether I get that client or not. Rebate guarantees and these alternative funding programs. And if I don't have them, I don't get those clients and they go somewhere else. So the system's broken. And it's, again, same system for the last 20 years. I don't have the answer. I wouldn't be here if I had the answer. But we need to talk about shared risk. We need to talk about value. And we can talk about whether it's value-based, risk share arrangements or value-based contracting or whatever. Again, pricing of pharmaceuticals, not on prevalence. So again, I've talked to, I don't know how many consultants in my 20 years where they come to me and say, well, this is a 3-second faster onset of action. Can I get 20% premium for that? As an example, right? Or there's this other disease state where it's 0.1% of the population. The drugs are $500,000. We're talking about a completely unrelated disease state, but it also has a prevalence of 0.1%. So can I also get $500,000 for that? And it's a symptomatic drug. It's not a disease modifier. So anyway, I will stop rambling. But it's frustrating. But what matters to us and what's always going to matter is comparative efficacy and comparative cost. That's what drives value to us. And then the other is appropriate utilization. But we have to come at this. We have to understand the drivers of the other stakeholders. And until we can de-silo, the patient is going to suffer long-term. And that's the unfortunate reality.
I just want to quick jump in because I'm so glad you brought it up. Anybody in this room who's ever heard me give a talk in my entire time here, I always say you have to put on the hat or put your feet in the shoes of everyone around the table to be successful. I say it all the time. We cannot dismiss the fact that the health plan has a job to do. They're paid just like everyone in this room is paid. You have to do your job. And their job is to find ways to cut savings. Every single person around that table has a job. And that's why we want to be at the table with those people. Because if we aren't at the table, we're on the menu. And that's what we believed at NHF and why we come to the table. But it is important to know and understand, because if we don't recognize it, then we can't find ways to go around it. And I believe that's what NHF CCSC really was about. You talk about what is it we can do? We've been coming to the table with solutions that have driven Sal will tell you, hundreds of thousands, even on one member, by looking at claims, showing them where there's a break, because they don't know what they don't know as employers. They're trusting the counsel of people who are conflicted. Because generally, if it's self-funded, it means there's a TPA who owns the PBM, who owns the SPP, and they want exclusivity on all the business. Well, there might be a conflict there. I mean, you think a little conflict. So we come in and we take a look at it and we show them. That's what we're doing. We're trying to circumvent these mud at the wall tactics by actually showing them ways to drive savings. So, sorry.
Yeah, no, thank you. And totally, Sal Morana, pharmacist with Alliant. Totally agree with the comments. I'll give a quick example to get back to the original question of like, what are the employers thinking of? And it's sort of the story of how I met Colette and Becky 3 years ago. AutoZone, national brand, 85,000 employees. They had 4 members with hemophilia. The costs were $6-7 million a year. And they're a very pragmatic group, very paternalistic. They love their AutoZoners, as they call them. And they want to do the right thing. So they asked me and the PBM at the time, big name PBM, tell us a little about these patients. What are we doing to make their quality of life and control costs? And the answer back from the PBM was a big silent nothing. They couldn't speak to it. They couldn't provide details. They couldn't tell us why the drug, cost was going up every year. They couldn't even, share anything that they were doing that might control that. Colette and I talked, and my eyes were open to a very different model. I'm a hospital pharmacist by background, so she reminded me of what good clinical care can look like. Actually managing the patient, managing the dosage so you're not wasting drug, not having a refrigerator in the garage full of factor that's not being used. If the patient has issues with weight gain or with risky behaviors, to coach them and to have that connectivity between the physician and the pharmacy. And so we worked with AutoZone and with their PBM to break the old model and actually move those patients' care back to a hemophilia treatment center and saw significant savings, and $1 million+ in savings. And the employer now can say, we understand what's going on, we support it, we want this member to get what they need. The director of benefits can go to their CEO and CFO and explain the costs, as opposed to creating what I think is when somebody's dealing with $1 million or numerous double-digit growth in their budget, they've got to explain it, or they've got to do something drastic to mediate it, right? So what AutoZone was able to do is explain it, understand it, and look for other ways, to find savings. To comment on the patient assistance, we see a lot of this. Me personally, we advise against it for 3 main reasons. Number one, it's not ethical to steal patient assistance from patients. I worked in hospitals where we had uninsured patients. If that patient assistance wasn't there, they weren't getting treatment. Number two, it's really kicking yourself in the face, because if you think about patient assistance, it's a line item on an Excel spreadsheet, and pharma is not stupid. They're going to raise the cost of the drug to overcome whatever patient assistance they're providing. So it's really kicking the can down the road. And number three, and this wasn't mentioned, but I'll mention it. Once an employer realizes that these patients will actually have to provide W-2s, tax information, pay stubs, it's an invasion of privacy. And most employers, once they know how invasive these things are, so we don't have any employers that have gone in this direction. They've all been approached, and they've all thought initially, hey, well, I can shave 20%, 50%. But once they know the facts, they open their eyes and they realize this is really a scam, and it's not good for anyone. So I'll pause there.
Sal, thank you so much. And so Becky, from a provider perspective and the HTC perspective, how have payer drug management interventions affected your operations and practice?
So it's definitely one of my frustration points when a payer tries to dictate what medications a patient should or shouldn't have. One of the things we saw in the early alternative funding was the fact that, oh, well, if they don't qualify for the patient assistance on their drug, they can just take another one. You should put them on this one. And that's, clinically inappropriate for a non-clinician to be making those decisions. But it's also become a big access to care issue, especially with the alternative funding situations or the maximizers, where it really does keep the patients from accessing their drugs in a timely manner, especially in acute care situations. I don't know how many of you have dealt with free program factor. It doesn't come quick. It's a week before a patient gets drug, and it's not appropriate for a patient to wait with a bleed for a week for the free program drug to get there. And that's assuming it comes with the supplies they need to actually infuse it. So it's become a big issue for us. I spend probably 40% of my day trying to fight situations like this. And most of the time I win. If not, I call Colette and it gets done. But it definitely does impact our practice quite a bit.
And I would also bring up the point when the specialty pharmacy dispensed the supplies, once they realized that they didn't dispense the drug, what happened?
Yeah, so what we've seen, and we saw this with our pharmacy, I've also seen it happen in diabetes, is that when you dispense the supplies, but you didn't dispense the original script, the payers are coming back retroactively and clawing back that payment because you were providing supplies for a non-covered service. So those supplies aren't actually even a covered benefit at that point. So,
and
then
you
it goes
cannot just
back
walk
onto-
in and get a port sterilization kit or infusion butterfly needles and the ancillary supplies that are necessary, and that can be hundreds of dollars. I mean, we're talking about more and more continued cost shift and burden for the patient. And the other piece is when you talk about the wait. What we have is patients, if they're having a bleed and they can't wait, or know that this could cause a permanent, debilitating, lifelong deal if they don't treat it, they're going where? To the ER, and that's getting charged to the plan, which is up to 10 times more cost. So they are seeing the kick the can down the road scenario. And Sal, and he's being modest because Alliant Employee Benefits, they have some of the biggest companies in the country that they are consultants for. So we do have that voice represented. You saw me point to him. So what we did with AutoZone, then they looked at all their books of business, and we've been tackling companies one at a time and going through and bringing those hemophilia patients back over to the HTCs and providing savings for those companies, which has been significant because those companies are now doing, we need you to do the alternative funding or we're going to go somewhere else, but we can now offer them this other solution that we've been doing as opposed to that decision. So.
Great. So Mark, if you could address this question as well.
Yeah, sure. I got too many microphones. So I've been doing this now, almost 25 years. And I think when I started out, my perception of all this stuff that we're talking about was that, number one, this is somebody else's problem, not mine. And number two, they'll figure it out. And that's obviously not true. I wouldn't be sitting here. This is my problem. And I did sign up for this when I decided I wanted to take care of patients with hemophilia. Because if we're going to get the best care for our patients, we have to be at the table, not on the menu, to pick up on Colette's point. So, in terms of my practice and my day-to-day job, this has changed because I now have to spend a lot of time doing this, but this is absolutely essential. This is as important as the clinical decisions I'm making in my clinic every week, because our patients aren't going to get access to the things they need, and our centers aren't going to survive if we're not part of this discussion. And so it didn't take me very long to figure that out, and talking with you guys and some of the conversations we've had over the last few years of being involved in this, I think what I've learned, and I think what we've all learned, is that we all have the same goals. We all want the most clinically and cost-effective care for our patients. Well, that doesn't happen if we don't talk to each other and we don't make sure that we're on the same page. And we actually are. We just have different ways of getting there. And so I think that's the biggest change for me, is just a recognition that this is my problem. This is something I have to do. And now I'm teaching that to my fellows. It wasn't taught to me. I was sort of taught, this is not your deal. Someone else will worry about the business end of it. And that's absolutely not true. So it has affected us in that way, and I'm glad that it has, frankly.
Great, thank you. I mean, we're getting some questions from the audience, and if you'll bear with us, and we'll place these towards the end of the presentations to make it a little easier to organize. So thank you very much. So looking into the future, are there opportunities for the management of hemophilia and other rare high-cost diseases in terms of aligning incentives and sharing risk among the providers and the purchasers of healthcare? And so I'll let Jeff start with this, and then Colette, if you could weigh in, and then we'll move on to our case study.
No, and I think we used to hear the word transparent a lot in my industry over the last decade, and I stopped saying that because, you know, obviously we're transparent. Everybody says you're transparent, but that doesn't mean anything anymore. So my new buzzword is aligned incentives. And, you know, I think that's the issue. So if you look at this, there's so many examples I can give where, you know, things aren't aligned. So, you know, a couple of years ago, we had a big problem with a couple of SPs because they were basically auto shipping PRN factor. And we're like, you know, what's going on with the patient, you know, with the bleeds? And they're like, oh, I don't know. So, right. And so you look at something like that and you're like, well, yeah, we have to manage this. If we don't, right, that gets passed on to the client. So stuff like that's starting to get cleaned up, but it really, again, not to harp on this, but it's de-siloing. It is aligned incentives. And so to me, the other kind of term we use a lot in this industry is value-based contracting, right? Everybody has VBCs, right? This is probably one of the areas where it would work. So if a pharmaceutical company and a payer could actually work towards that, yeah, we'll pay for something if it works, right? We need to understand the value of that. But if it doesn't work, why is the employer paying for 100% of that, right? So, you know, but it's not a lot of work for like a 1% discount. Those kind of things don't work. So I don't know what, you know, exactly how that works. Best price needs to be changed and a whole bunch of other things. The other thing, like Michelle and I have talked about, is this kind of on the flip side of a VBC is shared savings or some kind of, again, other shared risk. So we know HTCs are 340B entities. We get it, but, you know, our fee schedules are not based on 340B. So you know, how does 340B fit into this? And is it, you know, like we could talk about how that's kind of been misused, you know, not by HTCs, but just in the industry in a lot of different areas. But can we, and we know that a lot of the other, and we love HTCs, right? The quality of care is better. All the other stuff the HTCs do for patients. In fact, if you know, we try to direct our patients to HTCs. So I'm not coming at HTCs. I'm just saying that, right, if we're paying full boat for drugs and there's 340B, then again, how does that make sense, right? So I think a value-based contract or risk-based, it's probably not going to make sense in like diabetes or cardiovascular disease because you can't track it. You know, you can never tie an outcome to something, but we have claims. We know what other drugs patients are using. We know if they're taking prophylactic and PRN dosing. You know, we know if they have bleeds. We can actually talk about it. And it's a small enough population where we can actually manage it, where you can't do that with, you know, 25 million diabetic patients. So the opportunities are to do what you guys are doing, which is fantastic. This is you know, there are no other disease states where you have organizations like this that actually bring different stakeholders to the table. But that's the first step. The second step is, how do we talk about putting the patient in the middle of this where we are managing costs? Because again, if we don't address the elephant in the room, which is cost, our patients aren't going to have good coverage because their deductibles are going to be off, you know, through the roof or whatever happens, just because that's where it has to go as long as the employer is bearing the brunt of this.
Yeah, I want to add, because I think your point, again, spot on, and we are talking about a shared savings to start with, because we're talking about what are other ways we can work with the HCCs to bring in or to assure that they're going to be able to serve the members. Because, right, the big piece is the pharmacy component, but let's not forget, even if they don't get the pharmacy component, they're still doing all the same services with the patient that the patient expects. If the patient was going to a specialty pharmacy to get the drug, which simply acts as a person who picks it up from here and does this and bills for it, they get no other services. And if you leave that specialty pharmacy, the friendships and so do all the other perks that come with it. The HCC does a lot for this community, and it's changed the average life expectancy of 25 or less years to a normal life expectancy today. There's a lot of reasons to make sure the HCCs stay. But one of them is value-based contracting. One of them is like, let's start in the shared, we do need to get to a shared risk model. Let's start with the shared savings to dip their toes in the pond and do some pilots. And that's what we're trying to roll out. And we have some HCCs interested in engaging in some of those pilots so that we can put that data out and find ways in which it can pull the business back to the HTC because that is needed. I ran a hemophilia treatment center, one of the bigger programs. I never kept the 340B discount. We kept very little. We're an independent center. We didn't need to. And we were autonomous. We weren't owned by somebody else. So we were very aggressive in our pricing. But I could still argue that even if I bought it at less than Joe's specialty pharmacy, but I charge exactly what Joe's specialty pharmacy does. But for that, they get the doctor, the nurse, the care coordinator, all the pieces and services that go with it for the same price. Why would anybody challenge that? The problem is payers do not, first of all, remember, they're being advised by people who have misaligned incentives, right? They don't know what they don't know. They have no idea hemophilia treatment centers do everything you guys do because you don't bill for it. So they're not familiar with the model, what they're getting. So that's part of what we're trying to do is educate employers, working through employer, national and regional business coalitions, getting FaceTime with actual employers and having this dialogue and providing that education for them, which, ultimately, when we get to the new paradigm where these new treatments and therapies come to market and are going to change what we know today, that they're now recognized as these centers that they deserve to be recognized for, and we can find other ways to drive this revenue to them. And I also want to point out Jeff Blake in the room here from the Hemophilia Alliance. We work very closely together now more than ever. And they've also we pulled a working group together on this alternative funding group, and we're bringing in other disease groups now to make it more of a collaborative, across disease groups. So I did want to make sure I recognize that and all the other payer work you do too. So thank you, Jeff.
Colette, thank you. So we have a case study, kind of a difficult one to point out a number of important things here. So basically, a pediatrician is seeing a child who's brought by the mother because of concerns for bleeding and suspects that the patient may have hemophilia. So this is confirmed by Dr. Redding or one of the other hematologists, and the health plan or other case managers reached out to the family and is suggesting a consultation with an HTC, which is actually several hours away from the member's home. And I think Becky can relate to this scenario right away. There's only so many HTCs, and there's an awful lot of space in the U.S., especially as you get further west. And so many patients actually are rather far from the HTC. The family attended an initial comprehensive care visit and was given a treatment plan that included being trained on how to infuse factor for the infant in the home setting. It was placed on prophylaxis. And after follow-up, the case manager verified that the plan's contracted specialty pharmacy would be able to deliver the clotting factor within the assay management range of plus minus 5% and arrange for that home delivery. So I'd like to start out by asking some of our panelists to talk about this. So if I could ask Becky to start out and discuss what management's, ask Jeff and Sal to talk about management strategies for purchasers and how this illustrates those management strategies. Then beyond that, talk about specialty pharmacy and ask Becky to talk about the role of the HTC as a specialty pharmacy. So Sal, if I could ask you to start out.
Yeah, so previously we talked about the big box PBMs. They own specialty pharmacies. There's that conflict of interest. And what they've done is they've cornered the market with exclusive specialty. And we're trying to break that model. So I want to see a show of hands. How many of you have patients that have to use a big box specialty pharmacy, and in your opinion, that hurt their therapeutic outcomes? Okay, negative, right? So what we did with our relationship with PBMs is we basically did clinical evidence and essentially a medical appeal, a medical exception appeal to say this patient needs to be treated at a much higher level of care. So we're going to move them out of this exclusive requirement and allow them to use a pharmacy of not only their choice, but their provider's choice. And that's how we were able to get that. And I think the tide is turning on the exclusive specialty grip hold. Tennessee just passed a law this past year that allowed patients to make a choice of any willing pharmacy. We're starting to see that come across in other states. But it makes me think, I wonder if medical appeals, medical necessity appeals could be successful in breaking that model. I don't know if any of you had experience with trying that route, but it worked for us. And it definitely, when we asked the PBM, can you do these 4 things that the HTC can do? They were not able to provide those services and so, or commit to the outcomes. And so therefore we were able to get those exceptions. So just a thought out there, maybe a medical appeal, it's work, but it could help speeding up this breakdown of this monopoly that they have.
Jeff, would you like to comment for a moment?
Yeah, I'll be quick. I wish we had better strategies. Right now, all we do is prior auth these drugs basically for diagnosis because we have to. Because if I didn't PA a $300,000 drug, people would look at me and say, "What are you doing?" But we try to get out of the way for the most part. We're trying to have conversations around, again, shared risk and fee schedules, things like that. We are trying to get people into HTCs. We're focusing on, again, appropriate utilization, so assay management and acute or PRN with prophylactic. That's about it, right? So, but this is going to get worse before it gets better, and it's not per se in hemophilia, even though we alluded to, and Dr. Reddy, you're going to talk about the gene therapies, right, coming up. So the cost pressure on employers is going to continue to get worse. This week we were talking about it. There was a somewhat related gene therapy that was approved. It surpassed the $2.1 million that Zolgensma got for SMA a couple of years ago. It's $2.5 million. It's for transfusion-dependent beta thalassemia. Vertex has another one within the next couple of months. It's going to be for sickle cell and the same disease state. So that's where the pipelines are crowded. It's specialty drugs, it's orphan conditions, it's cell therapies, it's gene therapies, and some of these are now trickling into more common traditional disease states like diabetes and asthma. So the trends are unaffordable. We're heading to a cliff. And so what you're going to see is more egregious payer behavior. Unfortunately, I wish I could give you a different answer. There's a well-known health plan in the Midwest, well-known, that only covers gene therapies with a rider, right? So that means that if you get insurance from them, the only way you're getting access to a gene therapy is if you pay more for this additional coverage benefit. Now, if you have, let's say you're a parent and you don't know you're a carrier for SMA. Let's use that as an example, right? Why are you going to pay a premium to get access to these things? And then all of a sudden you're going to have a baby who has SMA and you're in trouble, right? So again, it's counterintuitive. It doesn't make sense. But again, think about risk. Where does risk fall? And if it falls on the employer, it's going to get worse rather than better. So again, we need to figure out how it's not siloed and all the risk falls on the employer. So again, not a good answer. I don't have an answer, but I'm just pointing out trends. They're not going to get better. So.
Great, thanks. So Becky, if you wouldn't mind addressing the question here on some of the specialty pharmacy strategies, what you're seeing, and also what HTCs as specialty pharmacies are doing.
Yeah, so if anyone has dealt, again, I talked to the time it takes for a patient to get access to drug. Program we know is horrible. Especially pharmacies aren't that much better. I have my nurses, they probably want to strangle me at this point because I have them document every time a patient calls us saying they haven't gotten their medication on time, saying it's taken them a week just to get a hold of someone at a certain 3-letter named pharmacy. So what we're able to do as the HTC pharmacy, and the conversation I have with employer groups and payers, is we're able to document how quickly we turn things around. We're able to document the fact that we're tracking bleeds through, looking at how many doses they have on hand when they call back for their refills. And we're able to target those bleeds, send that information over to the clinician so the clinicians can adjust doses if they need to, or they can look into what are the reasons that the patients are having these bleeds. I'm an accountant by trade. Numbers talk to payers, and they're going to get doors open that you won't get opened otherwise. So we make that number proposition. We show them the assay management that we do. We did this with Sal's group. We showed them, here's a year's worth of fills. Here's how we would have filled this patient, what would have gone out the door, the time frame it would have gone. Here's how much I would have charged you for it. Now go compare this to what you actually paid your SP and see where the savings are. And I would say 9 times out of 10, that's all the conversation that needs to happen, because they see that the clinical care is there. The clinical care is superior when it's coming through the HTC with the integrated pharmacy. And then the numbers make sense too, so it becomes a no-brainer.
And then there's the PRN dose management.
Yeah, the PRN.
And there's, the ability to react real time, and given the fact I ran the center that Becky now runs, I know that, they have a driver and they have on-hand inventory at all given times for every patient. And so it may not be their whole month supply, but they can react with the patient and get drug in their hands same day. No one else can claim that. Those are the ability for me to look an employer in the eye or a payer and say that I can tell you I can avoid unnecessary ER visits. That's the only answer, is that I'm local and I can respond. And we did holidays, nights, weekends. Now, I'm not saying every hemophilia treatment center has the same scenario, but there are certain things as payers we recommend. BCDI didn't write scripts for more than a month. It does put an extra burden on the nurses because you have to talk to the patient every month, but there was no auto-filling. We were able to identify at that phone call how many doses they had on hand PRN. And so then therefore, we weren't sending any extra PRNs that weren't necessary. All of that makes a difference in numbers. It's telling that story. The next step is then telling the story.
The other piece I would say is if you do have those acute situations that come up and you call the big PBMs, I can tell you 9 times out of 10, they're like, well, just send them to the ED. If they need it right now, just send them to the ED. Document every one of those, because that becomes part of your value prop to the payers. You show them, they know how much they're paying for an ED visit. They know the markup in an ED on clotting factor. They can run those numbers really, really quick. If you show them that in the past year, we've had 3 times where your PBM has told me they will not give me an override to fill this patient, just send them to the ED.
Becky, thank you so much. So moving on with our case study here, the family initially had difficulty affording the cost of the factory replacement therapy. Of course, there are deductibles and co-pays and those sorts of things. And so through follow-up with the nurse case manager at the HTC, the patient's mother was informed of a co-pay assistance program available from the manufacturer, and the case manager helped the patient's mother fill out the necessary paperwork, and the family was able to afford the cost of ongoing prophylaxis. And so, the questions here are what detrimental effects have been arising from alternative funding programs, the things that we've already discussed, and we've already talked about it a lot, but I think we could bring it back into the focus for this particular family. And from the purchaser perspective, what resources are available to patients and beneficiaries to help alleviate costs? So let's start here with Dr. Redding. And Mark, what have you seen in terms of the effects of these alternative funding programs? And then ask Becky also to talk about that, since you guys are on the front line and seeing the patients here.
Yeah, just the obvious effect is that if we make it hard for the patient to get their medication, they're not going to take it. And I don't think those of us that work in HTCs, you know what that means, right? Like you talked about this, the potential consequences of untreated or undertreated bleeds, lack of effective prophylaxis. These have lifelong consequences for the patient that go beyond just their physical health. It has to do with their mental health, their employability, their productivity. This affects all of us in society. And I know it sounds a little bit grandiose, but it's actually absolutely true. So I think the psychological burden on our patients and families just dealing with all this stuff and knowing that their medication's expensive, we need to be mindful of that. We need to make sure that we're doing what we can to support them and acknowledge that we're going to be there to help them. This is not their fault. So I think there are a lot of potential detrimental effects, but as I said in my previous comments, those of us that work at HTCs, we have to take this on as part of our job. This is every bit as important as figuring out what dose of factor to write for. It is being willing to participate in this discussion and this part of the care of the patient.
Great, thank you very much. So I'd like to just ask Sal, if you could just tell us very quickly here, from the purchaser perspective, what resources are available to the patients and the beneficiaries? And then we're going to move on to our question and answer session just for a few minutes.
Yeah, for the patients and beneficiaries, I mean, it's imperative we preserve the patient assistance for what it's intended for. I think the tide of high deductible health plans, I think that it's turning a little bit. I think a lot of employers realize that they've sort of maximized their ability to push costs back on employees, particularly for specialty. I think the clinical support that you offer, that's a huge component. And like I said earlier, we've got to break this, eventually try to break the monopoly and the sort of the conflicts of interest. But I think that patient assistance, as of today's talk, has to be preserved, because you're going to end up patients that have absolutely no other alternative. And without therapy, they're going to end up in the hospital. So.
Great. Thank you. That's great. So we're going to move on to our question and answer session. There are a couple of questions that have come from folks who are watching remotely today. And so, Becky, this one is about 340B pricing. And if you could describe the significance and the negative impact, perhaps, of 340B drug purchases with a change in HTC prescribing patterns, and specifically non-factor therapies, and how that's related to profit margin versus the traditional factors. So a multi-part question. You can take whatever part you
Really
want.
nice, easy one there.
Yeah,
30
exactly.
seconds or less. So non-factor therapies, especially as we look into gene therapy and things like that, it is going to change the paradigm. Once we see gene therapy hit, it doesn't matter if we're getting a 340B discount. The reality is you are not going to be able to sustain your program on just gene therapy. So that's where groups like CCSC are important to look at how we continue that sustainability, how we can work with payers to create meaningful discussions as to what's appropriate for patients and how we pay for that continued care that they're getting at the HTC.
Great, thank you. Jeff?
Here's another naive statement. It'd be nice to pay providers for their knowledge and their management of patients rather than what they dispense. So again,
Totally agree. However, again, I would say that you're not paying in this scenario of the model, and while it's right or wrong, the confusion is I'm paying the specialty pharmacy X. So if at a minimum, which my prices were always way lower than specialty pharmacies, but even if I was paying, you were asking you to pay the same, for that, you're getting the provider, the nurse, the social worker, the care coordinator, the dentist, the physical therapist. I mean, you're not getting that on the specialty pharmacy side, and you're not arguing about paying for it. I know it's a model unlike anything else, so you have to look at it a little differently. I would just challenge that statement, but I agree that that's the thought, because they don't understand what all happens within the program.
So this question was originally for Dr. Dunn, but I'll just go ahead and try to make a good answer here, which is that because a medication may be denied in the outpatient setting, this can lead to an admission or to an ER visit, which may delay or could delay discharge while the drug is being administered. And do health plans understand the huge costs they're incurring with these hospital days? Yeah, they know the cost of that. But the problem is that there is a disconnect between the management of the pharmacy benefit and people looking at the costs on the medical side. And so this is an extremely important thing for plans to be told by the HTCs, by providers. This is part of what the CCSC is all about, is trying to educate on the economics of the situation and how this is not the way to go. There's also a question about gene therapy. Dr. Redding has mentioned he's got another session where he's going to discuss this in much more detail. But immunity to the viral vector is a problem for patients, and there's been a couple of different approaches. In some instances, different gene therapies have been effective even for patients with antibody to the viral vector, but in others they have not. For the upcoming, what we expect to be approved for the gene therapies, My understanding is that they'll be testing for that for the hemophilia B patients and the hemophilia A patients, Mark?
Yeah, this is really a complex issue. This one's better. This is a really complex issue, and part of it has to do with the way the clinical trials have been done. So some clinical trials have excluded patients with pre-existing antibodies to the vector, and some have not. The hemophilia B gene therapy that's the closest to being here did not exclude those individuals, and patients with very, very high titers. There was one individual in that study who didn't respond, but there are other patients who had antibodies and they seem to respond just fine. So other studies have excluded them, and so we don't know the significance of them. So I think the real answer to the question is we don't really know. It's going to take additional studies and real world experience and follow up to sort all that out. We won't know all those answers from the clinical trials, and we certainly won't know all those answers when there's an approved product.
I also wanted to say that what payers have been saying is even if the FDA didn't, have one of the indications be that they can't have a pre-existing immunity because one of the products actually, it didn't seem to matter much. They can tell me for certain when their plan comes out, they'll be following how the trial went. So if they didn't allow people to get it with the pre-existing, they're certainly not paying for it until there's some proof down the road. And that's what I'm hearing loud and clear from payers. And I don't know if you have anything to say.
No, I agree with that. My comment was going to be, again, to reiterate, this is the perfect scenario for a value-based contract, right? So for us, the whole issue is with gene therapies are they a cure? What are we preventing, and how long do they last? What's the durability? So again, looking at SMA as an example, Zolgensma was priced at a 7-year offset of Spinraza. And lo and behold, what happened? We started getting, Spinraza requests. So, again, if the point of, factor is very effective. If the point of this is we're paying $2.5 or $4 million for this therapy, then we want it to last. And if somebody requires factor 2 months into this, then what are we doing? Right? So, and the other comment is just the challenge, the previous question, and Ed answered it very well, is the industry siloed, but even within payer organizations are siloed, just like probably anybody's siloed. The challenge, again, is how do we, when you talk about disease states like multiple sclerosis or rheumatoid arthritis or whatever, when 80 to 90% of the total cost is drug cost, it's really hard to talk about a hospitalization. Even though we never want somebody in the hospital, it's really hard to talk about it when you're paying 90% of total cost of care on drug.
Great. I want to thank the panel.
Yeah, no, they're telling me time because they have another session in here. If you want more questions, if you're an HTC that wants to get involved in CCSC, please reach out to us. Thank you guys so much for your time and the support of all of those of you in here who are supporting our efforts here. Thank you very much. And to our panelists, thank you, thank you.